Hello everyone and welcome to Brainfoot's Audios. Today, in this particular episode of CAT curriculum, we'll be looking at some previous year questions of the Common Admissions Test. Now, today we'll be looking at another section of the CAT examination, which is Verbal Ability and Reading Comprehension, or VARC. Now, thing that you should know is that sections such as data interpretation, logical reasoning, quantitative aptitude, and verbal ability and reading comprehension are the major sections, and each of these sections have further subsections, and questions are based on some of these subsections. So let's look at what our set of questions would look like today. So if you look at it, our PYQs today on VARC, verbal ability, is based on critical reasoning. And in VARC, as we saw in DILR, we're basically looking at one passage carefully in order to solve the questions that come after it. So we need to read this passage carefully and answer the questions based on it. So let's read the passage. Understanding where you are in the world is a basic survival skill, which is why we, like most species, come hardwired with specialized brain areas to create cognitive maps of our surroundings. Where humans are unique, though, with the possible exception of honeybees, is that we try to communicate this understanding of the world with others. We have a long history of doing this by drawing maps. The earliest version, yet discovered, was scrawled on cave walls 14,000 years ago. Human cultures have been drawing them on stone tablets, papyrus, paper, and now computer screens ever since. Given such a long history of human map making, it is perhaps surprising that it is only within the last few hundred years that the North has been consistently considered to be at the top. In fact, for much of human history, the North almost never appeared at the top, according to Jerry Broughton, a map historian. North was rarely put at the top for the simple fact that north is where darkness comes from, he says. West is also very unlikely to be put at the top because west is where the sun disappears. Confusingly, early Chinese maps seem to buck this trend. But, Broughton says, even though they did have compasses at the time, this isn't the reason that they placed north at the top. Early Chinese compasses were actually oriented to point south, which was considered to be more desirable than deepest, darkest north. But in Chinese maps, the emperor, who lived in the north of the country, was always put at the top of the map, with everyone else, his loyal subjects, looking up towards him. In Chinese culture, the emperor looks south because it is where the winds come from. It is a good direction. North is not very good, but you are in a position of subjection to the emperor, so you look up to him, says Broughton. Given that each culture has a very different idea of who or what they should look up to, it's perhaps not surprising that there is very little consistency in which way early maps pointed. In ancient Egyptian times, the top of the world was east, the position of sunrise. Early Islamic maps favored south at the top because most of the early Muslim cultures were north of Mecca. So they imagined looking up south towards it. Christian maps from the same era, called Mappa Mundi, put east at the top, towards the Garden of Eden, with Jerusalem in the center. Given that each culture has a very different idea of who or what they should look up to, it's perhaps not surprising that there is very little consistency in which way early maps pointed. Of course, this is actually a repeat, so let's move on to the next paragraph. So when did everyone get together and decide that north was the top? It's tempting to put it down to European explorers like Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan, who were navigating by the North Star. But Broughton argues that these early explorers didn't think of the world like that at all. When Columbus describes the world, it's in accordance with East being at the top, he says. Columbus says he's going towards paradise, so his mentality is from a medieval mappa mundi. We've got to remember, adds Broughton, that at the time, no one knows what they are doing and where they are going. So before we move on, if you notice, this particular paragraph here is repeated in the next slide. So I'm just going to cut it out. So makes it easier for us to discard it. Now that we've read the paragraph, we can see that there are 6 questions associated with this particular extract. So let's move on to the first question. The first question says, which one of the following best describes what the passage is trying to do? Now there are 4 options. Option A, it questions an explanation about how maps are designed. B says it corrects a misconception about the way maps are designed. C, it critiques a methodology used to create maps. D, it explores some myths about maps. So let's look at each option. Option D says it explores some myths about maps. Now, if you go back to the extract, let's click on it. Now, the extract talks about how maps are made, like the importance of maps, and the fact that North was not always put at the top. And it also talks about some of the other orientations that were followed in the early centuries before North was standardized at the top. So what we can see is that option D, which says some myths, let's go back to the first question. So option D says it explores some myths about maps. Now this makes the statement too general because our particular extract is talking about when and why North was placed on top of maps. So when and how and why were maps oriented towards the north? So option D is incorrect. Now option C says it critiques a methodology used to create maps. The critical point being critique. Now so these are the 2 important terms in the statement, critiques and methodology. Now if you go back to the extract, basic survival skill, this talks about maps, talks about directions, other directions. So as you can see, there is very little. Actually, if you look at the paragraph, you read the paragraph, there is no criticism. So there is no criticism on map making, especially its methodology. So here in this particular extract, they're specifically talking about how directions of maps were different, how map orientations were different. Some were south, some were orienting east, and the Chinese were orienting north, but not for north being having the magnetic north in their compasses. So so that's the actual statements. That's the actual subject of the extract. So there is nothing that talks about creation of maps or the methodology of doing so. And so therefore there is no criticism on the same topic. So option C is incorrect. Now what about option A? Option A questions explanation about how maps are designed. again, but if you look back towards our extract, so let's go back to the extract. Now, the extract does talk about the different directions, but if you read the extract, it says north was rarely put at the top for the simple fact that north is where darkness comes from, and it also talks about the reasons for why different directions were chosen, but it never talks about criticism of any of these approaches. It only says that the current approach of putting north on top of maps is just a convention from the past few centuries. So um, option A, which says questioning and explanation, doesn't happen. So option A is also incorrect. The right option, therefore, is option B, corrects a misconception about the way maps are designed. Now, what is the misconception? The misconception is north being on top of maps was always the precedent. So when we think of maps, we always thought, so we think that always they put north at the top, south at the bottom, west on the left, and east on the right. However, that wasn't the case. If you look at our first, if you look at the passage, our second paragraph says, given such a long history of human map making, it's perhaps surprising that it is only within the last few hundred years that the North has been constantly considered to be at the top. In fact, for much of human history, the North almost never appeared at the top, according to Jerry Broughton's research. So as you can see, the question, this passage corrects misconception on how maps were designed, and the misconception was north being on top of maps was how maps were always made, which is wrong. So that is the correct option, which is option B. Now let's look at our second question. Now the question says, early maps did not, again, when you have a question that says not of something, it's always a good idea to be extra vigilant because sometimes people overlook it and then they actually put in a reason that contradicts the question. So early maps did not put north at the top for all of the following reasons, except. So again, here we have three statements that are correct. One of them is incorrect. The incorrect statement is what we should identify. Now, if you look at the options, option A says north was the source of darkness. Now, we've already seen this, but just to show you, so again, if you look at it, this is paragraph 2. Jerry Broughton's first extract or quotes were talking about the fact that north is where darkness is from, which is why north was rarely put at the top. So as you can see, that statement is, let's go back, that statement is true, which makes the option incorrect. Now, if you look at option C, it says East and South were more important for religious reasons for some civilizations. Option D says East was considered by some civilizations to be a more positive direction. Now, let's explore both of these back in the passage. Now, if you go to the passage, there's very little consistency in the way early maps pointed. Egypt, if you look at Egypt, ancient Egyptian times portrayed east as the top of the world. Early Islamic maps favored south at the top of the world. So east and south were used by different religious civilizations. And especially for the Islamic maps, you can see that there was a religious contingent, there was a religious component because they wanted to look up to the Muslim center, which is Mecca. So again, Christians also had the same a similar reason. They put East as the top of the world in order to look towards the Garden of Eden, um, and that's how they did. And East is more positive. Again, we can look at Egyptian maps and early Christian maps. Both of them portray East as top of the world, so as to face something good. In the case of Egypt, that's the position of sunrise, and in the case of the Christian maps, the Garden of Eden, which was perceived to be in the east. So, um, as you can see, this is the penultimate paragraph, and it confirms that uh, options C and D are true. Religious reasons were present in Islamic and Christian maps, and more positive direction was considered by Egyptians and Christians. So both statements are true, which makes both options incorrect. The right answer is option B, South was favored by some emperors. Now, the statement itself is not wrong, um, because in China, if we go back to the extract, it says early Chinese maps seem to buck this trend. We go to the bottom of the paragraph. It says, in Chinese culture, the emperor looks south because it's where the winds come from. All right. And it's a good direction. North is not very good, but you're in a position of subjection to the emperor, so you look up to him. So now the emperor looks south because it's where the winds come from. So the reason why south was preferred by some emperors was because that's where the winds came from. So looking south means you faced headwind. Um, now, if you go back to our question number 2, of course, it says south was favored by some emperors, which is why early maps did not put north at the top. However, these some emperors in question are from China, and the Chinese civilization actually did put north on the top of the map. And their reason to put north on top of the map was because the emperor was in the north and he was portrayed to face south because the winds were from the south. So option B, south was favored by some emperors, was not a reason for early maps not portraying north. It was actually the reason why Chinese maps portrayed north as the top of the world in order to put the emperor above the subjects. So option B turns out to be the correct option because it's the wrong statement. Now, let's look at question number 3. According to the passage, early Chinese maps placed north at the top because um, the Chinese invented the compass and were aware of magnetic north. They wanted to show respect to the emperor. The Chinese emperor appreciated the winds from the south. North was considered the most desirable direction. All right. Um, if you look at option C, this is actually a continuation of what we talked about in the second question. Option C says the Chinese emperor appreciated the winds from the south, which is why Chinese maps placed north at the top. Now, that is not completely true because the Chinese emperor appreciated the winds from the south, and that's the reason for the emperor looking south in maps. And since the emperor is at the north, people wanted to show respect to the emperor, and that is why Chinese maps were placed north. So option B is actually the right answer. Option A and D are incorrect, and I'll prove why. North was considered the most desirable direction is wrong. If you go back to the paragraph on the Chinese maps, you can see that it says north is not very good. So the historian says north is not something that's very good. And again, at the early stages of the paragraph, it says early Chinese compasses were actually oriented to point south, considered to be more desirable than deepest, darkest north. So reading this paragraph would help you eliminate both options A and D. So the compasses pointed south. So that option A, is incorrect. The north was considered the most desirable direction. No, south was more desirable, the most desirable. Emperor appreciating the winds from the south was the reason why emperor looking south in maps. The right option on why Chinese maps placed north at the top is because the Chinese wanted to show respect to the emperor, because the emperor lived in the north. Now, let's look at the fourth question. It can be inferred from the passage that European explorers like Columbus and Magellan set the precedent for north-up maps, navigated by the compass, used an eastward orientation for religious reasons, navigated with the help of early maps. So let's look at each of the statements. Set the precedent for north-up maps. Now let's look at the other options first. Option D says navigated with the help of early maps. Now this statement is redundant because using maps to navigate to places was actually something that humans have done throughout history. So therefore, that statement is incorrect. Next, if we looked at option A, set the precedent for north-up maps. Now let's go back to the extract. This particular point is basically addressed in the last paragraph. It says Columbus described the world accordingly with east being at the top. So therefore, we have evidence that Christopher Columbus actually viewed east as the top of the world instead of north. So his maps were similar to Christian maps, which meant that option A is also incorrect. They did not set the precedent. Navigated by the compass, we've seen that the Chinese had compasses that pointed south. So option B is also incorrect. The right answer is option C, used an eastward orientation for religious reasons. They used Christian maps, which talked about the Garden of Eden being in the east, paradise being in the east. Now, let's look at question number 5. Which one of the following about the northern orientation of modern maps is asserted in the passage? The biggest contributory factor was the understanding of magnetic north, the role of European explorers, influence of Christian maps, not stated in the passage. Understanding of magnetic north. Again, no mention of this has been made in the passage, and it is also said that the Chinese used to put north at the top of the world because of the emperor being in the north. So option A is incorrect. Option B says the role of European explorers. However, they had east-facing maps. Example being Christopher Columbus. They used Christian maps. Again, we know that Christian maps, in the passage, it says that Christian maps faced east. So therefore, option C is also incorrect. The right answer is option D. The biggest contributory factor is not stated in the passage. If you go look at the passage, we talk about why maps are important, the fact that North almost never appeared on top, the reason why the Chinese were putting North on top, the other early maps by Egyptians, Islamic maps, as well as the Christian maps. Also talked about how Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan used east-facing maps because they were devout Christians. So we can see that there has been no mention on the biggest contributory factor of why modern maps faced north. So option D, the biggest contributory factor is not stated, is the right option. Now, let's look at question 6. The role of natural phenomena in influencing map-making conventions is seen most clearly in early Egyptian maps, early Islamic maps, early Chinese maps, early Christian maps. If you've gone through the passage, you would know that the Christian maps faced east because they considered east to be the direction where the Garden of Eden is present. The Chinese maps pointed north to respect the emperor. So again, as you can see, option D and option C are incorrect because they looked at conventions based on factors other than the role of natural phenomena. Early Islamic maps, again, wanted to put Mecca on top due to the fact that settlements were to the north of Mecca. Now, option A, that leaves option A as the right option, Egyptian maps. So again, if you look at the paragraph, which we will go back to, paragraph number 4, in the extract, paragraph number 4 says, in ancient Egyptian times, the top of the world was east, the position of sunrise. Now, of course, sunrise is a natural phenomenon. So even though it has religious connotations in ancient Egyptian culture, it is very clearly a natural phenomenon. So therefore, since ancient Egyptians based their maps on sunrise, the direction of sunrise, option A is the option where the role of natural phenomena in influencing map making is seen most clearly. So that means option A is the right option, early Egyptian maps. And it's due to the fact that they focused on east being the direction of sunrise. Now, that concludes this particular episode of CAT Curriculum. We hope you found this episode interesting and informative. For more of our useful and interesting content, don't forget to subscribe to Brain Blitz Audios. If you want to get more useful content from the channel, you can always visit it, or you can hit the notifications button present below the video in order to get the latest updates from Brain Blitz Audios, including but not limited to CAT Curriculum. So until the next webisode, take care, stay safe, ta-ta for now.